There is a peculiar contradiction woven into the fabric of human experience. When life is at its most painful, the heavens seem silent, and yet, if we dare to listen, this is when the voice of the divine resounds most clearly. Pain, contrary to our instincts, is not life breaking apart. It is life insisting on being heard. We imagine suffering as a detour, a cruel interruption, but it may be, in fact, the very road we were always meant to walk. In times of comfort, we become fluent in the language of ease. We measure success by applause, happiness by distraction, and meaning by momentum. But in the stillness of suffering, when the spotlight fades and the applause grows quiet, another language begins to speak. It is slower, it is deeper, it does not flatter, but it heals. This is the voice not of despair, but of awakening. We must be honest. Pain is unwelcome. No one seeks it, and yet it is one of the few things in life that will not lie to us. Pleasure can flatter us into complacency. Success can deceive us into self-sufficiency, but pain strips away illusion. It narrows our vision to what is essential. It reminds us that we are not invincible, not eternal, not complete. And in that revelation, we begin to hear something greater. It is not that God is louder in suffering. It is that we are finally quiet enough to hear him. Pain has a way of silencing the noise. When the career stalls, when the relationship breaks, when the diagnosis comes, our soul begins to ask questions it had long buried. What am I really living for? Who am I without applause, without certainty, without comfort? These are not academic questions. These are questions of the soul, and God answers through them. Some interpret suffering as divine punishment, but pain, in many cases, is not wrath but mercy. It is the surgeon's knife, not the executioner's blade. It cuts, yes, but to heal, it does not destroy the self. It exposes the false self, the one addicted to approval, the one obsessed with control, the one built on fear, not faith, and in that vulnerable space, when all is stripped bare, we begin to feel a different kind of presence. Not the God of the easy answer or the quick fix, but the God who sits with us in the ashes, the God who reshapes our hearts while the world watches our brokenness. There is a sacred stillness in sorrow. It is not absence, it is intimacy. In fact, some of the deepest spiritual growth occurs not when we are full of joy, but when we are full of questions. The divine is not threatened by our doubts. He often uses them as the soil for deeper roots. You see, when life hurts most, that is precisely when eternity presses closest. When our eyes are too tired for illusion and our hands are too weak to hold anything temporary, we begin to reach for what is unshakable. Many of the world's most transformative lives were not shaped by comfort, but by crisis. The valley is not just a place of loss, it is a place of vision. What we learn in the shadows cannot be taught in the sunlight. We emerge not just with survival, but with wisdom, not just with wounds, but with testimony. So if you find yourself today in a season of silence, of pain, of waiting, do not mistake it for abandonment. Perhaps it is the sacred pause before the transformation. Perhaps you are not being punished, but prepared. And perhaps, just perhaps, the pain you carry is not a sign that God has forgotten you, but that He is, in fact, speaking loudest. Pain is not an interruption, but a communication. It is tempting to treat pain as an outsider, an intruder in the story of our lives. But what if, rather than a break in the script, pain is the ink with which the most honest chapters are written? We often live as though suffering is life gone wrong, a glitch in the system of what ought to be. But in the economy of the soul, pain is not a breakdown, it is a broadcast. It is a divine signal penetrating through the fog of routine, shaking us out of our numbness and directing our attention to what truly matters. When everything is going well, we rarely stop to ask the deeper questions. Our schedules are full, our minds distracted, our emotions dulled by the constant rush of modern life. In ease, the soul dozes. In suffering, it wakes. Pain speaks in a tone that is neither polite nor soft. It is stern, urgent, and unavoidable. It cuts through our excuses, our distractions, and our self-deception. It refuses to let us pretend. We say we want truth, but truth often requires discomfort to be heard, and pain, in its raw and unwelcome honesty, delivers it. It reveals who we really are beneath the surface. It exposes the parts of us that we've hidden even from ourselves, the pride that pretends to be confidence, the fear masked as ambition, the bitterness that festers under the smile. Pain has a way of dragging these things into the light, not to shame us, but to offer us a chance to be remade. The reason pain feels so personal is because it speaks in a language that only you can hear. It does not generalize, it localizes. It arrives at the very point where you had hoped to remain untouched. For one person, it may be the loss of control. For another, the shattering of identity. For yet another, the collapse of certainty. But wherever it strikes, pain forces a confrontation between our expectations and reality. The illusion of control, especially, is one of the first things pain dismantles. We build our lives carefully, jobs, relationships, plans, identities, and then something crumbles. Suddenly, we are face to face with the fragility of everything we assumed was stable. It is in these moments, when the scaffolding of our self-made lives collapses, that we begin to perceive a deeper architecture, one not built by our hands, but already present beneath the rubble. There is something strangely clarifying about suffering. It reveals that much of what we chase is weightless in the face of real pain. Success, status, and security do little to quiet a breaking heart. But pain opens the door to that quiet honesty, the recognition that we are finite, dependent, and deeply in need of something more than what we can achieve. In this way, pain is not merely something to endure, it is something that speaks. And what it says, if we are listening, has the power to reorient our entire existence. The discomfort we feel is not always cruel, it is often crafted, not by chance, not by chaos, but by a wisdom that sees beyond the moment. Sometimes the interruption we resent is the intervention we need. Pain may silence the noise around us only so that we can finally hear the call within us. It is worth noting that communication through pain does not mean instant clarity. Often, the message unfolds gradually, through reflection, through surrender, through long nights where answers do not come, but perspective begins to grow. It is not always what pain says immediately that matters, but what it invites us to seek. In the quiet aftermath of suffering, many people find not just survival but calling, not just scars but direction. Pain, then, is not the end of the story. It is a turning point. It is not a distraction from life's purpose, but often the doorway into it. It invites us to listen differently, to live more truthfully, and to walk more humbly. It demands that we slow down long enough to ask, not how do I escape this, but what is being revealed through this. If we dare to believe that the deepest kind of love does not always comfort first, but confronts, then pain becomes more than a burden. It becomes a mirror. And once you have seen what lies beneath the surface, once you have heard the voice that speaks through brokenness, it becomes almost impossible to return to the illusion of silence. The ache remains, yes, but so does the awareness. And with that awareness comes a kind of strength that ease could never have taught. God whispers in pleasure, speaks in conscience, but shouts in pain. If pain is a form of communication, then we must ask, why is it so loud? Why does it feel so deafening, so unignorable? The answer lies in the way we live. In comfort, we surround ourselves with distractions. We fill every hour with noise, notifications, entertainment, achievements, plans. Even when we are at rest, our minds are rarely quiet. In that state, it is nearly impossible to hear the quiet voice of the divine. But pain does what luxury cannot. It silences the distractions, strips away the surface, and demands that we pay attention. When we are content, the voice of God is like a distant breeze, gentle and easy to miss. It is not because God is absent, but because we are preoccupied. In moments of pleasure and success, we are often convinced that we are in control. We feel self-sufficient, independent, even untouchable. In such times, God whispers, perhaps through gratitude, perhaps through beauty, perhaps through moments of stillness, but we rarely notice. The volume of our own desires drowns out the subtle frequency of that whisper. But in pain, something changes. Pain amplifies the spiritual signal. It removes the insulation that pride and comfort build around the soul. It forces us to pause. In deep suffering, the ego has no defense, no clever explanation, no performance to fall back on. That is when God's voice, previously muffled, becomes unmistakable, not because he was silent before, but because we finally stopped talking over him. Conscience is another space where God speaks, though it often goes unrecognized. When we face moral choices, when we know deep down that something is right or wrong, that is a voice worth heeding. Yet even conscience can be dulled. Repeated compromise, habitual distraction, or relentless busyness can push it into the background. But pain brings everything to the front. In pain, we are more honest about who we are. We see our flaws, our regrets, our longings more clearly. And when we see ourselves more clearly, we hear conscience more clearly too. It becomes harder to ignore truth when life itself has stripped away our ability to pretend. It's not that God delights in our pain. He doesn't, but he uses it. In pleasure, we often seek escape. In pain, we seek answers. That is a powerful shift. Pleasure can tempt us to ask, how can I get more of this? While pain urges us to ask, what does this mean? What do I need to learn? That question, born out of suffering, opens the heart to deeper wisdom. There is something deeply human about not listening until we are forced to. We often delay important change until the cost of avoiding it becomes unbearable. Pain becomes the loudest voice in the room, not because it enjoys shouting, but because we would not listen to anything softer. Many people can trace their greatest transformations not to the moments of ease, but to moments when life collapsed, and all they had left was the silence where God began to speak. This shouting, this divine urgency, is not always comforting, but it is loving. It may not answer our questions immediately. It may not explain why, but it calls us to wake up, to open our eyes, to reevaluate everything we assumed to be true. It is often in pain that we discover that the things we once idolized, status, control, image, are painfully hollow. That realization, though difficult, is an invitation to discover something deeper, something unshakable. What's even more striking is how personal the voice of pain is. It reaches each of us differently. For some, it's the loss of a dream. For others, it's betrayal, sickness, or loneliness. But whatever the form, the message often echoes the same truth. You are not as in control as you thought, but you are not alone either. There is something, someone, reaching into your pain, not to explain it away, but to walk with you through it. Pain is not the only way God speaks, but it is often the clearest. In suffering, all the unnecessary things fall away. The masks come off, the distractions lose their hold, and in that space of raw honesty, the soul is finally quiet enough to hear what has been there all along, not just a voice, but a presence, not just an answer, but a relationship. The shout of pain is not a punishment, it is a calling to return, a calling to realign, a calling to remember what we were made for. And once that voice has been heard in its fullness, once we've recognized that it speaks not only truth but love, we are never the same again. We carry the sound of that shout in our hearts even when the pain fades, because what we heard in the depths continues to shape how we live on the surface. Suffering forces the soul's attention to what truly matters. When the shout of pain finally reaches us, louder than the noise of our routine, more persistent than our distractions. We are left with no option but to face what we've long avoided. We are driven inward, not by choice, but by necessity. The soul, so long neglected under the weight of daily performance, is suddenly brought into focus. It is in this raw, unfiltered space that the illusions begin to crack. There is a kind of honesty that only suffering can produce, not the curated honesty we offer in conversations or social media posts, but the kind that takes place in the quiet of night when no one is watching. When suffering silences the outside world, the inside world begins to speak, and more often than not, it tells us truths we didn't want to face, how fragile our hopes were, how shallow our priorities had become, how we had mistaken comfort for meaning. We begin to realize that much of what we invested ourselves in held little weight. The titles, the opinions of others, the deadlines, the race for more, all of it starts to feel strangely hollow when the soul is hurting. Suffering makes us ask what actually matters, not what appears to matter, not what we were told should matter, but what, in the face of pain, actually holds. In such moments, people often discover they have built their identity on shifting sand. They thought they were defined by success, by appearance, by their plans. But suffering has a way of sweeping those things aside, revealing the unadorned person beneath. And for some, that exposure is terrifying, because it shows just how disconnected we've become from our own souls. But this forced confrontation is not cruelty, it is mercy, a painful mercy, one that drags us out of the artificial and into the eternal. It is here that priorities begin to rearrange. Things we once ignored now demand our full attention. We begin to value honesty over image, presence over productivity, love over achievement. Suffering doesn't make these values true, it simply uncovers that they always were. Relationships come into sharper focus, not the ones we maintain for convenience or appearance, but the ones that carry us when we cannot walk alone. In suffering, we see who we truly trust, who listens, who stays, and more importantly, we see who we have been to others. Have we been present? Have we loved deeply, or only when it was easy? Suffering does not allow us to hide from these questions. It insists we answer them. Time, too, changes its weight. Hours feel different when you are hurting. Days move slower, and yet they seem to slip through your hands more quickly. Suddenly, we realize how much of life we've spent waiting for the right time to do what truly matters. Apologize, forgive, reach out, start again. But when suffering presses against our sense of immortality, we begin to see time as it really is, a gift, not a guarantee. Even faith is redefined. In comfort, faith can become routine, a set of practices, words, and traditions we perform without depth. But in suffering, faith is no longer a ritual. It is a lifeline. You stop asking if the words sound good and start asking if they are true. You stop caring if the prayer is eloquent and start caring if it's real. The soul becomes hungry, not for answers, but for presence, not for escape, but for endurance. That hunger itself is sacred. There is also an awakening of compassion. When we suffer deeply, we suddenly understand others more. Their pain is no longer theoretical, it's familiar, and that familiarity breeds grace. We speak slower, judge less, listen more. The heart, once hardened by self-focus, is softened by shared experience. We no longer look at broken people with condescension. We recognize ourselves in them. Suffering strips us bare so that we might be rebuilt. It unmasks our false gods, control, image, certainty, and invites us to discover something sturdier, something eternal. The shift is not always immediate, and it is never easy, but those who have suffered deeply and reflected honestly often emerge with something that comfort cannot produce: clarity. And this clarity doesn't come as a dramatic epiphany. It comes in small, quiet moments, a conversation that goes deeper, a silence that feels holy, a tear that isn't wiped away in embarrassment but allowed to fall. In these moments, the soul starts to speak, and for the first time in a long time, we actually listen. This is the work suffering does. It reorders us, it refocuses us. And in doing so, it gently but firmly leads us away from the noise of what we thought mattered toward the stillness of what actually does. Pain is a tool, not a punishment. Once the soul has been forced to look at what truly matters, once the distractions fall and the illusions fade, there comes the next hard realization. The suffering we feared was not sent to destroy us. It was sent to shape us. In our human thinking, we are quick to associate pain with failure or guilt. We believe if we are hurting, we must have done something wrong. But life is far more complex than a simple cause and effect equation. Not all suffering is punishment. Some of it is preparation. We assume that comfort is the sign of divine approval, and pain is the evidence of divine rejection. But this is a misunderstanding of both life and growth. When a sculptor chisels away at stone, it is not because the stone is useless. It is because the stone has potential. The chisel is not cruel, it is intentional, and the process is not punishment, it is transformation. In the same way, pain often functions as the chisel that chips away the unnecessary parts of us to reveal the strength and depth that was hidden underneath. There are things about ourselves we simply cannot discover without going through fire. Patience is rarely developed in ease. Compassion is rarely born from abundance. Humility rarely comes when everything is going our way. These traits, the deepest and most essential parts of human character, are almost always refined through struggle. Not because pain is good in itself, but because pain removes the barriers that keep us from becoming good. We tend to resist the idea that growth requires discomfort. We want spiritual maturity without surrender, wisdom without wounds, courage without fear. But life doesn't work that way. Growth and pain are often inseparable. Much like how broken bones grow back stronger at the fracture point, the places where we've been torn open by suffering often become the places from which our greatest strength flows. In that strength, there is also a strange kind of peace, not the peace of avoidance, but the peace that comes from understanding. When we realize that pain has not come to curse us, but to cleanse us, we begin to accept the process. Not with a smile, perhaps, but with a steadiness. We begin to see the value in the struggle. We see how certain attachments needed to be broken, how certain beliefs needed to be challenged, how certain parts of our identity needed to be removed so that something truer could take their place. This is not to say that every pain has a quick or clear explanation. Many wounds take years to understand. Some never fully make sense in this life. But even in those, the pain still has a purpose. It awakens us, sharpens us, and sometimes it even slows us down long enough to reconnect with what we've lost. The pain we hate can become the place where we recover the parts of ourselves we forgot: our honesty, our vulnerability, our spiritual hunger. Even our prayers change. We no longer pray for things to go back to the way they were. We pray for the strength to become someone new. We stop begging for immediate relief and start asking for deeper endurance. We stop praying only for answers and begin to ask for wisdom. And sometimes, even when the pain remains, something within us begins to heal. That inner shift, that silent transformation, is proof that pain is doing more than breaking us. It's building us. We may not notice the transformation right away. We may feel like we're drowning, stuck, overwhelmed. But months later, in conversations or decisions, we catch ourselves responding differently, more patiently, more courageously, more gently, and in that moment we realize the pain taught us something. It changed the rhythm of our hearts. It reshaped our reflexes. We carry the weight differently now, not because it disappeared, but because we became stronger under it. pain does not mean we are far from God. Often it means we are in the middle of His greatest work in us, not the kind of work that gets applause, but the kind that creates depth, the kind that teaches us how to love people better, how to endure longer, how to live more freely, not chained by fear or ego. The kind of work that rarely happens when life is easy. Suffering then becomes a sacred tool, not because we enjoy it, but because through it we begin to see more clearly, love more deeply, and live more authentically. The soul, once shaken by pain, becomes more aware of what truly matters and more open to the slow, refining process that brings lasting change. Pain, though uninvited, is not wasted. It carves out space within us for the very things we once lacked: grace, truth, and strength. Despair is not silence from God, but the stillness where He waits. Once we begin to accept that pain is not a punishment but a tool, once we recognize that transformation is often born from suffering, we then come face to face with a deeper and darker valley, despair. This is where pain lingers longer than we expected. This is where the answers don't come, the change feels too slow, and the soul begins to wonder if God has gone quiet. But what feels like silence is not absence. It is not abandonment, it is a different kind of presence, a quiet, steady presence that refuses to rush what must be refined slowly. Despair is not a loud emotion. It's not the cry of panic or the scream of fear. It is the heavy quiet that settles over the soul when hope feels too far away to reach. It's the moment after the breakdown, when the tears stop not because you're okay, but because you're empty. And in that emptiness, we assume God has stopped speaking. But that's a misinterpretation. God does not always speak in words, and His presence does not always come with fireworks. Sometimes He sits with us in the stillness and says nothing, because what we need is not a new message, but to absorb the one He's already given. This is one of the hardest truths for the suffering soul to accept, that God may be present in the silence, because everything in us craves resolution. We want the pain to mean something. We want the story to move forward. But often God does His deepest work not in motion, but in stillness, not in clear answers, but in the long waiting. Despair, then, becomes a kind of spiritual wilderness, not a place where God has vanished, but a place where we are learning to hear Him without the usual signs. Stillness forces us to confront the core of our beliefs. Do we trust God only when He speaks loudly and clearly? Do we believe in His love only when we feel it emotionally? Or are we willing to believe in His presence, even when we can't detect it with our senses? In despair, we are given the chance to build a quieter kind of faith, not the faith that moves mountains with shouts, but the faith that keeps walking when all it hears is silence. This kind of faith is not weak, it is strong. It is forged in the slow furnace of doubt, loneliness, and exhaustion. It is the faith that doesn't rely on emotional highs, but clings to truths remembered. Truths like, I am not alone. Truths like, there is purpose, even in this. These are not easy truths to believe when despair wraps itself around the soul like fog, but it is in repeating them, often without feeling, that something deeper begins to take root. In despair, we stop performing. We stop pretending. We drop the act because we are too tired to maintain it. And strangely, that honesty is the very thing God has been waiting for. The truth of who we are, unpolished, broken, doubting, is not a threat to Him. He meets us in that rawness, not to condemn us, but to quietly strengthen us. The stillness becomes a sacred space, not a punishment for our weakness, but a resting place for our soul. Many people mistake the silence of despair for divine disinterest. But it may be that in these quiet moments, God is teaching us the difference between dependence and attachment. We may have been attached to certain outcomes, certain comforts, certain timelines, but now, in the quiet, those attachments are stripped away. What remains is dependence, not on what God gives, but on who He is, And this is where something surprising begins to happen. In the slow, quiet stillness of despair, a new kind of strength is born, a strength that doesn't shout or shine, a strength that sits, breathes, and waits, a strength that refuses to let go, not because it understands everything, but because it believes something deeper than understanding, that love does not leave, that hope is still alive even when buried, that presence can exist without noise. The stillness of despair becomes the soil for patience, for endurance, for compassion, and eventually for joy, not the joy of everything being restored to how it once was, but the joy of discovering something eternal in the ashes, not a happiness born from changed circumstances, but a peace that somehow emerged in the middle of them. God may not be speaking loudly, but he is not absent. He may not be changing the external situation immediately, but he is changing you. That transformation, that slow, sacred work, often happens where you least expect it, not in the spotlight, not in the miracle, but in the stillness of despair. Where the valley of suffering births the mountain of purpose, after sitting in the stillness of despair, where God's silence is not absence but presence, where waiting becomes a sacred classroom, there comes a slow unfolding, often unnoticed at first. It begins not with dramatic revelation, but with a subtle shift, the realization that the pain wasn't pointless, that the valley, dark and deep as it was, did something to us, and more than that, it prepared us for something. Purpose doesn't always arrive dressed in clarity. It often shows up quietly, carrying the weight of everything we've endured. We don't climb the mountain in a moment. We crawl, we stagger, we look back again and again. But with every small step, we begin to sense that the suffering wasn't just a detour. It was the foundation. What broke us also rebuilt us, and that rebuilding wasn't random. It was shaping us for the very thing we were created to carry. Most people believe purpose is found in talent or passion, but those who have walked through deep suffering know that true purpose is often born from pain. It grows in the cracks, in the places where we thought we were finished. It grows where we were most empty, because those who have known loss often become the most generous with grace. Those who have sat with sorrow often become the best at sitting with others in theirs. And those who have faced despair without answers often become the clearest voices of hope, not because they have everything figured out, but because they've walked through the silence and kept going. Purpose rarely announces itself with fanfare. Instead, it waits quietly at the edge of recovery, ready to take shape in the aftermath. Sometimes it's found in comforting others with the same comfort we were given. Sometimes it's found in choosing to live fully, even when the wounds still ache. And sometimes it's simply choosing not to waste the pain, to let it mean something. That choice, quiet as it may be, is a declaration. I didn't suffer in vain. Pain softens what pride had hardened. It clears space for deeper empathy. It teaches the kind of wisdom that cannot be learned from books, only from experience, and this wisdom becomes fuel for purpose, not a flashy, ego-driven mission, but a grounded, faithful kind of purpose. One that shows up in real life, in parenting with more patience, in loving more sincerely, in working with more integrity, in living with more depth. Many people think purpose is discovered at the top of the mountain, after the struggle is over. But the truth is, the climb itself defines the shape of your calling. Every fall, every bruise, every tear rewrites your understanding of what truly matters, and that understanding becomes your compass. It teaches you where to go, who to reach, what to say, and most importantly, how to say it. You cannot teach what you haven't lived. You cannot comfort where you haven't been cut. And so, your wounds become not just your history, but your credentials. Not your shame, but your power. What you thought disqualified you becomes the very thing that qualifies you to step into someone else's storm and say, "You're not alone. I've been here, and there's a way through." That is purpose. Not perfection, not performance, but presence, showing up, being available, living truthfully. Purpose is not about having all the answers. It's about becoming someone who can sit with questions, with people, with suffering, and not run away. It is about carrying light into dark places, even when that light is small, even when it flickers, and in this way the valley becomes the training ground, the silence becomes the shaping, the suffering becomes the strength. The parts of you that were broken in private begin to speak life in public, not loudly, not dramatically, but authentically. That authenticity is magnetic. It doesn't draw attention to you. It draws people toward healing, toward hope, toward God. We often wait for our lives to feel perfect before we think we can be used. But more often, purpose finds us precisely where we feel unfinished, where we feel weak, where we are still healing. Because purpose is not about being whole before helping. It's about letting the healing process itself be part of the help. The climb to purpose doesn't erase the valley behind you. It honors it, it carries it, and it transforms it. You stand not in spite of the pain, but because of it. The same valley that once broke you now becomes the ground beneath your calling. And the voice that once felt silent in your suffering now speaks through your life, through your story, your growth, your grace, with power that can only be born from the valley.